Well, I got my notes, check. Sunglasses, check. Hat, check. Pepsi, check. Thick skin, check. Let's go. Hey, welcome to Golden Blue Dude, everybody. If you're a college football fan, might as well hit the like and subscribe button because that's all we do over here. Go check out our Patreon page. We call our Patreons the shot callers because that's exactly what they do around here. And when the regular season gets here, our Patreons will get to decide which game we'll live stream, and you'll get to watch with Golden Blue Dude. And the score prediction contest will be coming back. Every week I pick out a game and my Patreons guess the score, and whoever comes closest to the score wins 20 bucks every single week, and you can win as many times as you want. The higher the Patreon, the more guesses you get per week. Ah yes, the Big 12 and the ACC. Only one will remain. We're all certain that the SEC and the Big Ten, they're going to be fine. Whether they have a magical number in mind, they're going to split off from the NCAA, create their own league, have their own rules, enforce their own rules, and have their own governing body. But who survives with them? And I know I've talked about this at length many times, but today I'm just going to flat out do comparisons between the Big 12 and the ACC to determine who has the best chances of survival. The pros of the ACC and the Big 12 and the cons of the ACC and the Big 12. Then maybe you and I both can make a rational decision to determine, hey, which one of these conferences has the best chances of survival? Let's figure it out. We'll start with the Big 12 and start with their pros. What's good about the Big 12? Well, the first thing is the Big 12 is centralized. What do I mean when I say centralized? Well, the core of the Big 12 is the Midwest of the United States. Center of the United States, so they could expand west and they can expand east, and it would make sense either way. So the fact that they are centralized in the Midwest actually helps the Big 12 whenever they want to invite members, and travel really isn't that big of an issue, except when it comes to the East teams playing the West teams. But there's a nice chunk of middle for compromise, so that's actually in favor of the Big 12. The next thing is they're actually in current negotiations with a TV deal. Now, we have the numbers. We know roundabout what they're going to make. Around 40 to 50 million a year. Closer to 50 million, which is not bad. But it's still not SEC or Big Ten money. But it's not bad, especially when you compare to the Pac-12 and the ACC money. Better. So that's also good for the Big 12. And it means that they're not locked into anything yet. Another thing is the Big 12 still a Power 5 conference. They have survived in spite of being picked apart, and they're still a Power 5 conference. First go around, they lost Missouri, Texas A&M, Colorado, Nebraska, gained West Virginia and TCU, lost 4, gained 2, and then last go around they lost Oklahoma and Texas, but gained BYU, Cincinnati, Houston, and UCF. So all around, lost 6, gained 6. But we would all agree that they lost more than what they gained because of brand recognition and how much money those brands that they lost made. So it's really not quite equal, just in terms of number. The last pro about the Big 12 is it's a good but not elite football conference. They are an elite basketball conference, but that's a different story. We're talking about football. I think basketball is a whole different animal. I don't think this plays as big of a factor as football. I mean, you have the NCAA tournament. It literally says NCAA tournament. So basketball will not be able to split off from the NCAA. So this is strictly football. So they're a pretty good football conference, but not elite. By the way, if there's anything that I don't mention as far as a pro or a con for both the Big 12 or the ACC, feel free to let me know in the comments section. I'm sure I'm going to miss something. Now, the pros for the ACC. First thing, grant of rights. I'm just going to go ahead and get that out of the way. The grant of rights. Grant of rights, ironclad from what I'm hearing. It's going to be a very difficult task to get around the grant of rights. But I'm hearing that the SEC lawyers are doing their darndest to find a loophole to try to grab some teams out of the ACC. The next pro for the ACC is what I just mentioned. Tough for teams to leave because of the grant of rights. That's a pro. That's going to keep teams from leaving because those are hefty penalties. If you leave the ACC, depending on what year you leave, you're going to owe a lot of money to the ACC, and you're not going to be able to make any money. It's all going to go to the ACC because they own your rights. That's why it's called grant of rights. You're giving your rights to the ACC. The third pro about the ACC, they actually have blue bloods, unlike the Big 12. They have Clemson, Florida State, and Miami for blue bloods in the ACC. And those brands, even if they're struggling right now, create a lot of money. and they help the ACC stay relevant. So the ACC does have blue bloods. 3. The fourth pro for ACC is they do have ties with Notre Dame. Notre Dame is a full-time member of the ACC in all sports except hockey, Big Ten, and football. They're still independent. However, they were a full-time member back in 2020, and they really, really liked it. I've heard from Notre Dame boards that it's picking up steam that they really want to join the ACC in 2025. But that's a different story. My main point was they have ties with Notre Dame. That's a big pro for the ACC. The last pro for the ACC is if the SEC lawyers can find a way to avoid the grant of rights, it would be easier to invite and get more teams. So the grant of rights is a blessing for the ACC, but it's also a curse. So now let's get into the cons. Speaking of curses, let's get to the cons. The Big 12's cons. They do not have an ironclad grant of rights, and they've proven time and time again they are an easy target to pick teams out of. That is a big time flaw for the Big 12. I don't know if they're going to come up with an ironclad grant of rights and be like, hey, if it works for the ACC, it's going to work for the Big 12. But as of right now, they do not have an ironclad grant of rights. And I think the new grant of rights will be in 2025. We'll see how that goes. But as of right now, between now and 2025, it is easy to pick teams off from the Big 12. So they have a big old bullseye on their back. The second con for the Big 12, they are the most susceptible to getting picked apart. I know that kind of falls into what I just talked about, but compared to the ACC, they're more susceptible because of the grant of rights. Finally, the third con is they actually don't have any blue bloods anymore. Texas and Oklahoma are going over to the SEC. That leaves the Big 12 without any blue bloods in college football. So there's no, quote, main attraction to draw in other big-time brands. But that could also be a good thing because blue bloods that might be looking to leave the ACC can be like, hey, we can be the star attraction in the Big 12. But for this scenario, I'm counting it as a con. That's not a good thing for the Big 12. No blue bloods in football for the Big 12. Now jumping back to the ACC, what are the cons for the ACC? They actually have a geographic disadvantage. They're on the East Coast. So them grabbing teams out of the Pac-12 doesn't make as much sense as the Big 12 grabbing teams from the West Coast. But the Big Ten has proven geography doesn't matter. Is the ACC going to follow the footsteps of the Big Ten? Well, that leads me into the second con, and that's tough for teams to join because of the grant of rights. So that's what I was saying earlier. The grant of rights is a blessing for the ACC because it can keep teams from leaving, but it's also a curse for the ACC because it can keep teams from joining. The third disadvantage, bad money. The ACC does not make a lot of money, and the new TV deal for the Big 12 is better than what the ACC's current TV deal is, and they're locked into that for 2036. So teams in the ACC like Clemson, Miami, the big brands, are going to make less money than the Big 10, the SEC, and the Big 12 until 2036, unless the grant of rights can get figured out. The fourth con, I just mentioned it actually, they're stuck in this till 2036. It's not like the grant of rights and the TV deal is over next year or a couple years from now. It's 2036. That is over a decade. That is a very, very long time. The fifth con for the ACC is if the SEC lawyers do figure out how to avoid the grant of rights, teams can actually leave quite easily. In fact, immediately. Because honestly, the only thing that I see that keeps teams in the ACC right now are the grant of rights. So if the lawyers of the ACC can figure out a way to avoid that, teams will leave in droves. At the same time, they could also accept teams. So now you can see why I'm calling the grant of rights both a pro and a con for the ACC. Finally, the last con for the ACC, they are a mediocre football and basketball conference. I know basketball is a different animal altogether, so we're going to stick with football. Mediocre, that's it. Clemson has been carrying the ACC over the last decade. I know Florida State won the national championship in 2013, but for argument's sake, Clemson has been carrying the ACC over the last decade. Look, Clemson did not win the ACC last year. What happened? The ACC missed the playoffs. Every time Clemson wins the ACC gets into the playoffs. And if they don't, apparently, the ACC is not going to make the playoffs. So there you go. There's my pros and my cons for both the Big 12 and the ACC. Now it's your turn. Y'all let me know in the comments section who has the best pros and who has the worst cons, and who do you think survives between the ACC and the Big 12. That's all I got for this show. Like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you on my next show.